The United States of America. Born in 1776, our country is the offspring of a religious-based heritage of liberty under law. Blessed with great natural resources and a pioneer people given to industry and moral discipline, our nation grew to be strong and prosperous and developed the finest governmental system ever devised by man. America soon became known as the refuge of the world's tired, hungry, and poor. Millions left everything in the old world to start over in a land that rewarded initiative and hard work and perseverance. The many millions who didn't come here found comfort and hope in knowing that indeed there was such a bastion of freedom and opportunity, a place where dreams could become reality. Today, our nation appears wealthier and more powerful than ever. New technologies have revolutionized our daily lives. Luxuries once enjoyed only by the rich are commonplace and very affordable. Home ownership is widespread, and our people have the expectation of continued economic growth and prosperity. Yet more and more people are coming to realize that they may prosper materially only for a time because their freedoms are diminishing. The sobering reality is that America has been led far from its praiseworthy beginnings. Our people and businesses groan under a heavy burden of economic, political, and social problems, which are the result of a widespread departure from the fundamental truths that made our nation great. If the United States of America is to endure, citizens far and wide must once again come to understand, embrace, and live by timeless concepts called Americanism. What made America great and set it apart from other lands? Was it natural resources? No, other lands are equally blessed. Was it the people? No, the people who built America came from elsewhere. Was it government planning and wisdom that spurred our nation to such heights? No again. It wasn't what government did that made America great. It was what government was prevented from doing that made the difference. What set America apart from other lands was freedom for the individual. Freedom to work, to produce, to succeed, and especially to keep the fruits of one's labors. America became great precisely because the stifling effect of too much government had been prevented. However, freedom in America was not totally unrestrained. Americans overwhelmingly chose to limit their actions with moral codes such as the Ten Commandments, personal morality, and limited government. It's a combination that characterized America and made it the envy of the world. When our founding fathers decided they'd had enough of British oppression, they broke away and declared independence. They stated as self-evident truth in the Declaration of Independence that men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. In other words, God gave man his rights, and that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And in the very next sentence, the founders defined the proper role of government when they stated that to secure these rights, governments are instituted. This is the entire philosophical base of our nation. Here, the government cannot legitimately redistribute the wealth, assume power over the people's lives, and dominate man's existence with oppressive taxation, regulations, and controls. According to the founders, government was to be a negative force, which leaves people alone. Its sole function is to protect citizens from one another and from foreign governments, and especially from their own government itself. The founders did not create a government to be a positive force, to do things for people, to take from some, to give to others. They understood that when a government starts doing something for one citizen, it has to take from another to do so. And in the process, it gains control over both. Britain's rulers didn't accept the Declaration of Independence, so our forefathers had to fight a war to make it stick. By 1783, the War for Independence had been won, and British forces were sent back across the sea. But the governmental system at that time was weak. It had no power to settle disputes between the states, nor the power to tax for proper needs, such as national defense. So in 1787, delegates from 12 of the 13 states met in Philadelphia to revise the system, and they produced an entirely new governmental structure known as the Constitution of the United States. Keeping faith with the thunderous assertions in the Declaration, the Constitution was written to govern the government, not the people, and not the states, each of which was a jealous guardian of its own sovereignty. The founders created a central government with strictly limited powers. This left the states free to compete with one another to be the best state, the one with the least amount of taxation and controls, one where citizens would want to build a business and raise a family. That spirit of competition produced excellence, as honest competition always does. It's important to note that the Constitution wasn't forced on the people. It was sent back to the states for ratification, and several of the Founding Fathers wrote essays explaining it in an effort to persuade fellow Americans to adopt this new system of government. Some of the essays written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay were collected into a volume known as the Federalist Papers. Those essays provide valuable insights into the intent of the founders in establishing our government. Eventually, all 13 states ratified the Constitution, and then each ratified the first 10 amendments known as the Bill of Rights, further tying the hands of the federal government. These amendments are indeed about rights, but it would have been better had the Bill of Rights been labeled the Bill of Limitations on Government. Why? Because it's vital to realize that the Bill of Rights never gave citizens any rights whatsoever. Its sole purpose was to safeguard God-given rights by limiting government power. The founders even insisted that Congress shall make no law about speech, religion, the press, assembly, the right to petition, the right to keep and bear arms, and so on. These amendments are directed squarely at the federal government, not the individual and not the states. They are like most of the 10 Commandments, which are essentially thou shalt nots. The Bill of Rights says Congress shall not, all the way up to the marvelous 10th Amendment, which says in effect, if we forgot anything, you can't do that either. When Benjamin Franklin exited the Constitutional Convention, he was asked by a woman, "Sir, what have you given us?" His immediate response was, "A republic, ma'am, if you can keep it." Yet most Americans today have been persuaded that our nation's governmental system is a democracy and not a republic. The difference between these two is essential in understanding Americanism and the American system. Before we discuss political systems, however, it's helpful to address the confusion that has been spread about the political spectrum. Many have been led to believe that the political spectrum places groups such as communists on the far left, fascists or dictators on the far right, and political moderates or centrists in the middle. However, a more accurate political spectrum will show government having 0 power on the far right to having 100% power on the far left. At the extreme right, there is no government. The extreme left features total government under such labels as communism, socialism, Nazism, fascism, princes, potentates, dictators, kings, any form of total government. Those who claim that Nazis and fascists are right-wing never define their terms. This amounts to spreading confusion. Toward the middle of the political spectrum can be found the type of government limited to its proper role of protecting the rights of the people. That's where the Constitution of the United States is. Those who advocate such a form of government are really constitutional moderates. So let's analyze the basic forms of government. They are monarchy or dictatorship ruled by one, oligarchy ruled by a few, democracy ruled by a majority, republic ruled by law, and anarchy, which is ruled by no one. In discussing these 5, we'll see that they can be narrowed down to even fewer. Looking first at monarchy or dictatorship, this form of government doesn't really exist in the practical sense. It's always a group that puts one of its members up front. A king has his council of nobles or earls, and every dictator has his bureaucrats or commissars, the men behind the scenes. This isn't ruled by one, even though one person may be the visible leader. It's ruled by a group. So let's eliminate monarchy, dictatorship, because it never truly exists. Oligarchy, which is ruled by a group, is the most common form of government in all history, and it is the most common form of government today. Most of the nations of the world are ruled by a powerful few, and therefore oligarchy remains. At the other end, we find anarchy, which means without government. Some people have looked over history and found that many of its worst crimes were committed by governments, so they decided that having no government might be a good idea. But this is a mistake, because as the ancient Greeks stated, without law there can be no freedom. Our founding fathers agreed and held that some amount of government is a necessary force in any civilized, orderly society. In a state of anarchy, however, everyone has to guard life, liberty, and property, and the lives of family members. Everyone must be armed, and movement is severely restricted because one's property has to be protected at all times. Civilized people have always hired someone to do the guarding, a sheriff, a police force, or some branch of government. Once law enforcement was in place, the people were freer. They could leave their property, work in the fields, and so on. In short, the proper amount of government makes everyone freer. There are some who advocate anarchy, however, not because they want no government, but because they don't like what they have. They use anarchy as a tool for revolutionary change. The condition of anarchy is very much like a vacuum where something rushes in to fill it. These calculating anarchists work to break down the existing government with rioting, killing, looting, and terrorism. Tragically, the people living in such chaos often go to those best able to put an end to it and beg them to take over and restore order. And who is best able to put an end to the chaos? The very people who started it. The anarchists who created the problem then create a government run by them, an oligarchy, where they have total power. This is exactly what happened in Russia that led to Lenin taking total power, and in Germany, where Hitler's brown shirts created the chaos that brought him to power. But anarchy isn't a stable form of government. It's a quick transition from something that exists to something desired by the power-hungry. It's a temporary condition, and because it isn't permanent, we eliminate it as well. The word democracy comes from two Greek words, demos, meaning people, and kratein, meaning to rule. Democracy, therefore, means the rule of the people, majority rule. This, of course, sounds good, but suppose the majority decides to take away one's home, or business, or children. Obviously, there has to be a limit. The flaw in democracy is that the majority isn't restrained. If more than half the people can be persuaded to want something in a democracy, they rule. What about republic? Well, that comes from the Latin, res meaning thing, and publica meaning public. It means the public thing, the law. A true republic is one where the government is limited by law, leaving the people alone. America's founders had a clean slate to write on. They could have set up an oligarchy. In fact, there were some who wanted George Washington to be their king. But the founding fathers knew history, and they chose to give us the rule of law in a republic, not the rule of a majority in a democracy. Why? Let's demonstrate the difference in the setting of the Old West. Consider a lynch mob in a democracy. 35 horseback riders chase one lone gunman. They catch him, and they vote 35-1 to hang him. Democracy has triumphed, and there's one less gunman to contend with. Now consider the same scenario in a republic. The 35 horseback riders catch the gunman and vote 35-1 to hang him, but the sheriff arrives, and he says, "You can't kill him. He's got his right to a fair trial." So they take the gunman back to town. A jury of his peers is selected, and they hear the evidence and the defense, and they decide if he shall hang. Does the jury even decide by majority rule? No, it has to be unanimous, or he goes free. The rights of the government aren't subject to majority rule, but to the law. This is the essence of a republic. Many Americans would be surprised to learn that the word democracy does not appear in the Declaration of Independence or the U.S. Constitution, nor does it appear in any of the constitutions of the 50 states. The founders did everything they could to keep us from having a democracy. James Madison, rightly known as the father of the Constitution, wrote in essay number 10 of the Federalist Papers, "Democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. Alexander Hamilton agreed, and he stated, "We are a republican government. Real liberty is never found in despotism or in the extremes of democracy." And John Adams, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, stated, "Democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself." The founders had good reason to look upon democracy with contempt, because they knew that the democracies in the early Greek city-states produced some of the wildest excesses of government imaginable. During that period in Greece, there was a man named Solon who urged creation of a fixed body of law not subject to majority whims. But where the Greeks never adopted Solon's wise counsel, the Romans did. Based on what they knew of Solon's laws, they created the 12 tables of the Roman law and, in effect, built a republic that limited government power and left the people alone. Since government was limited, the people were free to produce, with the understanding that they could keep the fruits of their labor. In time, Rome became wealthy and the envy of the world. In the midst of plenty, however, the Roman people forgot what freedom entailed. They forgot that the essence of freedom is the proper limitation of government. When government power grows, people freedom recedes. Once the Romans dropped their guard, power-seeking politicians began to exceed the powers granted them in the Roman Constitution. Some learned that they could elect politicians who would use government power to take property from some and give it to others. Agriculture subsidies were introduced, followed by housing and welfare programs. Inevitably, taxes rose and controls over the private sector were imposed. Soon, a number of Rome's producers could no longer make ends meet, and they went on the dole. Productivity declined, shortages developed, and mobs began roaming the streets, demanding bread and circuses from the government. Many were induced to trade freedom for security. Eventually, the whole system came crashing down. They went from a republic to a democracy and ended up with an oligarchy under a progression of the Caesars. Thus, democracy itself is not a stable form of government. Instead, it is the gradual transition from limited government to the unlimited rule of an oligarchy. Knowing this, we as Americans are ultimately left with only two choices. We can keep our republic, as Franklin put it, or we will inevitably end up with an oligarchy, a tyranny of the elite. Just as there is widespread confusion regarding political systems, there is similar confusion in the economic arena. All during the 20th century, Americans were led to believe that there was a great struggle going on between capitalism and the communist world. Undoubtedly, a struggle existed, but the real adversaries were rarely identified properly. No discussion about economic systems will make sense without first defining terms. And one of the most basic terms in economics is capital, whose definition is the means of production. To illustrate what capital is, let's consider a very simple economy. On the sands of a small island, a castaway has just washed ashore. He has no food and he's hungry. He searches the island, he finds no berries, coconuts, or anything edible. He goes back into the water and tries to catch fish with his bare hands, but he fails. So he goes back up on shore and he finds a bush. He breaks off a branch, he gnaws at one end to make a sharp tip. Back into the water he goes, and with his spear, he catches fish. His spear is capital. It's the means of production for catching fish. He gave up some of his time and some of his energy to produce something he could not eat, but something that would help him to produce something that he could eat. Capital, therefore, can be tools, machinery, and even a man's handmade spear to catch fish. Such being the case, consider that the communists in the former Soviet Union, as well as in China and Cuba, have always used tools and machinery. Officials there even view people as capital. Therefore, by strict definition, are not communists capitalists? For that matter, isn't everyone a capitalist? And so, Is not every economic system a capitalist system? What then is the difference between what the communist system is and what the American capitalist system is supposed to be? The difference is ownership of the capital. Is the system monopolistic, state-controlled capitalism, or is it competitive, free enterprise capitalism? It is between these two opposing economic systems that a battle has always raged. Before we proceed, let's also define free market. Basically, it's a self-regulating system in which all parties are completely free to transact with one another. But where force, fraud, or injury damages one party, the government's role is only to punish those who commit such offenses and to vindicate the rights of the other party. This protects the integrity of the free market, or free enterprise system, without intervening in it. The term private property also needs clarification, for private ownership and control of property is a key component in the free enterprise system. In order for ownership of property to be full and complete, all four of its aspects must be met. These are title, control, use, and the ability to dispose of what a person owns. In a free market economy, these aspects are unrestrained, so long as the owner does not infringe on the legitimate rights and claims of others. True ownership of property and freedom go hand in hand. They always have. Now let's compare the two systems of capitalism. In the competitive free enterprise system, capital or property is both owned privately and controlled privately. In the monopolistic system, holding title to capital can be accomplished privately or by the state. But more importantly, capital is controlled by the state or by the elite few who control the state. The Communist Manifesto, which contains the basic program for all communists and all socialists, explicitly preaches the destruction and abolition of private property. Karl Marx understood the powers of controlling capital, and so have all communists and socialists who have ever looked and still look to Marx as their leader. State-controlled capitalism results in high prices and low quality. After all, why would a monopoly strive to improve if it has no competition? On the other hand, honest, thrifty, and hardworking producers throughout the world prefer a competitive free enterprise system for all. Here, low prices and high quality prevail because a variety of producers will seek to attract the widest amount of customers. Competition results in excellence and always has. Just as the political spectrum shows the range of government power, we can also plot the various economic systems along another spectrum. These forms of government control in the market stand in sharp contrast with a completely free market. In the last century or so, there have been basically four forms of state-controlled economies, all on the far left of the economic spectrum: fascism, Nazism, socialism, and communism. In each, the government controls the capital. The difference among these is how much is owned or controlled outright by the government. In a fascist system, the government doesn't own businesses on paper, but it does control them. In Mussolini's Italy, even though he didn't hold title to businesses, he told the owners what to produce, how much to produce, when to produce, where to buy raw materials, who to hire, who to fire, and what price to charge. The rest, he said, was up to them. The fascist system is more efficient than other state-controlled systems insofar as those living under it think they still own their businesses. Shopkeepers concern themselves with maintenance on the machinery, employee relations, painting the building, and so forth. But the government controls owners through an array of taxation and regulations. Under Nazism, which means National Socialism, its proponents went one step further and acquired ownership of some corporations such as Volkswagen. However, Hitler didn't seize ownership of other industrial giants, he simply controlled them, just as Mussolini had controlled businesses in Italy. Socialism is where government officials acquire possession of major industries such as transportation, communications, and utilities in order to leverage control over the entire economy. Through ownership of these vital segments of industry and by creating government regulatory agencies, socialists gain control over virtually everything else. Finally, there is communism, the granddaddy of all in the economic sense. In a way, communism is more honest than fascism because all of the capital is owned and controlled by the state. There are no pretenses about it. Now let's combine political and economic systems, because ultimately one never exists without the other. We see again that there are only two ultimate choices: a competitive free enterprise system in a republic, or a monopolistic state control system under an oligarchy. A moral people have always been a vital element of America's strength. The Founding Fathers well understood the biblical teaching that righteousness exalteth a nation. They also knew that expecting a free market economy and limited government under a republic to endure without morality was expecting the impossible. James Madison cautioned that limited government alone was inadequate for our nation. And John Adams observed, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." George Washington stated, "Reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle." Yet there are people today who think that liberty is license and that morality is unimportant or irrelevant to politics and economics. But as Benjamin Franklin added, only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become corrupt and vicious, they have more need of masters. The alternative to Americanism is what has condemned most of the human race to live as slaves throughout the millennia. It is the idea that rights are privileges dispensed by an oligarchy according to the unlimited rule of men, that the state should control or own the nation's capital with all economic activity directed from a central power, and that morality is inconsequential, and that security is preferred over freedom and opportunity. Our nation continues to be steered off course, and the principles that led to America's greatness are being cast aside. The simple question for us is, do we continue the slide away from our nation's founding principles, or do we return to the kind of government we inherited? Time is running out for Americans who sense that something is wrong. They have to decide what kind of a country we shall leave for future generations. All that is needed is for a sufficient number of Americans to get involved in the fight for freedom and to return our nation to less government, more responsibility, and with God's help, a better world.
When you hear the word Constitution, what's the first thing you think of? Is it free speech? The right to bear arms? Or the right to a speedy and public trial? These individual liberties, known as the Bill of Rights, were not part of the original Constitution. Instead, they were added 3 years later. Why, you might ask? In 1787, 39 delegates signed in favor of the Constitution, while 3 others present, George Mason, Edmund Randolph, and Elbridge Gerry, refused because they saw a fatal flaw. They demanded a Bill of Rights. This concern did not stop the Constitution from being sent out for ratification. However, during this time, a quarrel known as the ratification debates began between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. It was argued the Constitution lacked specific limits on government power. In order for some states to ratify, the condition was made that a Bill of Rights had to be added. Following the ratification of the Constitution in 1788, James Madison took on the responsibility of drafting amendments that would protect our individual rights. By 1789, Madison proposed 19 amendments to the House. The House narrowed the number of amendments down to 17. Next, the Senate, with the agreement of the House, narrowed them down to 12. Finally, these 12 were sent on to the states for ratification. 10 of the 12 amendments were quickly ratified, and by December 15, 1791, enough states had ratified to authorize the adding of this list, known as the Bill of Rights, to the Constitution. Today, the Bill of Rights defines the rights and freedoms of the individual and is vital to the republic in which we live. It is a powerful instrument which we the people can use to defend our freedom, not only today, but for generations to come.
Is the Constitution outdated? This question comes from a misunderstanding of the Constitution. In Federalist 45, James Madison tells us the powers given to the federal government are few and defined. These powers were primarily to deal with foreign relations, such as war, peace, and trade. The states were left to deal with internal matters that affect the lives of the people directly. This allows the states to change with the times and needs of the people. This also places the majority of government power closest to the people, where the people's voice has the most influence. The problem is, the federal government has taken over many of the powers that were meant to be left to the states. The solution is not to change the Constitution, but to restore the constitutional balance of powers. This will happen when we understand and demand adherence to the Constitution.
Today, when men in the public spotlight are asked to express their opinion on the myriad of government proposals and projects, all too often their answers seem to be based not upon any solid principle, but upon the popularity of the specific government program in question. Any program that appears to be popular will seldom be opposed by them. This seems especially true if they are already in or seeking to gain some public office. When men must make decisions on vital political questions of the day, these decisions should be based upon and measured against certain basic principles regarding the proper role of government. The American concept is that our government was instituted of God for the benefit of man, and that God holds men accountable for their acts in relation to it. This concept declares that no government can exist in peace except such laws are framed and held inviolate as will secure to each individual the protection of life, the right to own and control property, the free exercise of conscience, and that all men, while protected in their inherent and unalienable rights by the laws of such government, are bound to sustain and uphold the respective government in which they reside. This concept holds that sedition and rebellion are unbecoming every citizen thus protected and should be punished accordingly. At the same time, however, holding sacred the freedom of conscience and the right to properly dissent. Securing and protecting the rights, liberty, and freedoms of every individual is generally agreed to be the basic and most important single function of any government. But what are those rights, and what is their source? Until these questions are answered, there is little likelihood that we can correctly determine how government can best secure them. Let us first consider the origin of man's freedoms and rights. Man's rights are either God-given as part of the divine plan, or they are granted by government as part of the political plan. God or government, these are the only two possible sources. Thomas Paine, author, statesman, and one of the greatest patriots in the days of the American Revolution, stated unequivocally, "Rights are not gifts from one man to another, nor from one class of men to another. It is impossible to discover any origin of rights otherwise than in the origin of man." In this magnificent treatise on freedom, Frederick Bastiat pointed out life, liberty, and property do not exist because men have made laws. On the contrary, it was the fact that life, liberty, and property existed beforehand that caused men to make laws in the first place. Reason, tradition, and religious convictions all lead us to accept the divine origin of man's rights. For if we reject this and accept the premise that human rights are granted by government, then we must be willing to accept the corollary that they can be denied by government. The First Amendment of the Constitution sets forth the doctrine of separation of church and state, as traditionally interpreted to prohibit the establishment of an official national religion. This is proven to be both wise and beneficial. But current interpretations, which divorce government from any formal recognition of God, is a trend that strikes a potentially fatal blow at the concept of the divine origin of man's rights and unlocks the door for an easy entry of future tyranny. The struggles and sacrifices of early generations enable Americans to enjoy the blessings of freedom today. This proud inheritance will have been forsaken if Americans should ever come to accept that their rights and freedoms are instituted among men by politicians and bureaucrats. The framers of our Declaration of Independence knew well the lessons of history. The noble document they drafted still stands as a monument to their wisdom, and each of us should re-examine and keep in mind the inspired words they set forth. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Since God created man with certain unalienable rights, and man in turn created government to help secure and safeguard those rights, it follows that man is superior to government and should remain master over it. A government is nothing more or less than a group of citizens who have been hired to perform certain functions and discharge certain responsibilities. Government itself has no innate power or privilege to do anything, for its only source of authority and power is from the people who have created it. We, the people, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. These words from the preamble to the Constitution of the United States show this firm foundation on which our government was founded. It is equally important to keep in mind that the people who create a government can give to that government only such powers as they themselves have in the first place. Obviously, they cannot give that which they do not possess. So the question, simply stated, is, what powers properly belong to each and every person in the absence of and prior to the establishment of any organized governmental form? The answer to this question is vital to an understanding of the principles which underlie the proper functions of government. There is no doubt that each man is justified in using force if necessary to defend himself against physical harm, against theft of the fruits of his labor, and against his enslavement by another. Indeed, the early pioneers found that a great deal of their time and energy was being spent in defending themselves, their property, and their liberty. But in order for man to prosper, he cannot afford to spend his time constantly guarding his family and his property against attack and theft. So he joins together with his neighbors and hires a sheriff. At this precise moment, government is born. The individual citizens delegate to the sheriff their unquestionable right to protect themselves. The sheriff does for them only what they had a right to do for themselves, nothing more. Now let us go a step further in the question of man's right to delegate power. Suppose Pioneer A has one horse. He also wants another horse, but does not have the money or other means to buy one. Pioneer B has 3 horses, and Pioneer A decides that he would like to share in his neighbor's good fortune. Is he entitled to take one of his neighbor's horses? Obviously not. If his neighbor wishes to give it or to lend it, that is another question. But so long as Pioneer B wishes to keep his property, A has no just claim to it. If A has no proper power to take B's property, he obviously cannot delegate any such power to the sheriff. Even if everyone in the community desires that B give his extra horse to A, They have no right individually or collectively to force him to do so. They cannot delegate a power they themselves do not have. No government can justly claim the power to seize and redistribute the people's wealth and property, or to force reluctant citizens to perform acts of charity against their will. Government is created by man, and no man possesses any such power to delegate to government. Therefore, the proper role of the various levels of government include such defensive activities as maintaining the national military and local police forces for protection against loss of life, loss of property, and loss of liberty at the hands of either foreign despots or domestic criminals. It also includes those powers necessarily incidental to the protective function, such as the maintenance of courts, where those charged with crimes may be tried and where disputes between citizens may be impartially settled. The establishment of a monetary system and a standard of weights and measures, so that courts may render monetary judgments, taxing authorities may levy taxes, and citizens may have a uniform standard to use in their business dealings. Before people lend their support to any government program or project, they should examine it carefully. Those who give their support to questionable government programs are acting very short-sightedly. They ignore history and fail to recognize that government is no plaything. As George Washington warned, government is not reason. It is not eloquence. It is force. Like fire, it is a dangerous servant and a fearful master. Copies of the Constitution are widely available. This is a standard that each of us can refer to and use in determining whether a law is good or bad. This inspired document is a solemn agreement between the citizens of this nation, which every officer of government is under a sacred duty to obey. Our Constitution wisely limits the functions of the federal government, leaving the great bulk of legitimate activities of government to be carried out at the state or local level. It is a firm and sound principle that the smallest or lowest level of government that can possibly undertake the task is the one that should do so. First, the city or community. If they cannot handle the problem, then the county level of government should be considered. If the county level is unable to deal successfully with the problem, then next the state. And only if no smaller unit can possibly do the job should the federal government be considered. This is merely the application to the field of politics of that wise and time-tested principle of never asking a larger group to do that which can be done by a smaller group. Thomas Jefferson understood this principle very well and cautioned, "Let the national government be entrusted with the defense of the nation and its foreign and federal relations. The state governments with the civil rights, law, police, and administration of what concerns the state generally. The counties were the local concerns of the counties, and each ward direct the interests within itself." This great American patriot went on to answer a question that seems to have confused man throughout history. What has destroyed liberty and the rights of man in every government which has ever existed under the sun? The generalizing and concentrating of cares and powers into one body. It is well to remember that it was the 13 separate and sovereign states of this republic that created the federal government and delegated certain limited powers to it. The federal government did not create the states. Welfare programs, schemes for distribution of the wealth, and other programs which coerce people into acting in accordance with a prescribed code of social planning are government activities which today pose a grave danger to the individual American's continued freedom. A simple test can be applied to every government program. Do I, as an individual, have a right to use force upon my neighbor to accomplish a particular goal? If I do have such a right, then I may delegate that power to my government to exercise on my behalf. But if I do not have that right as an individual, then I cannot delegate it to any level of government. To be sure, there are times when this principle of the proper role of government is most annoying and inconvenient. But the creature will exceed its creator and become the master if government is permitted to manufacture its own authority out of thin air and to create self-proclaimed powers not delegated to it by the people. Once government seizes the aggressive role of redistributing the wealth and providing so-called benefits for some of its citizens, it then becomes a means for what is accurately described as legalized plunder. Legal plunder is defined by Bastien as, quote, when a portion of wealth is transferred from the person who owns it without his consent and without compensation, and whether by force or by fraud to anyone who does not own it, then I say that property is violated, that an act of plunder is committed, unquote. Once legal plunder begins occurring, history proves that each class or special interest group competes with the others to grasp and throw the lever of governmental power in their favor, or at least to immunize itself against the effects of a previous thrust. Labor gets a minimum wage. Agriculture receives a price support. Consumers insist on price controls. And industry gets protective tariffs. In the end, none of them are much further ahead. But all of them lose some of their personal freedom. The welfare state, and finally totalitarianism, has always been the end result when the principle of the protective function of government gives way to the aggressive or distributive function. This is a vitally important but seldom heeded lesson that history offers. It is people who work and produce, that create wealth. All historians know that no government in the history of mankind has ever created any wealth. According to Karl Marx, a human being is primarily an economic creature. In other words, man's material well-being is all-important. His privacy and his freedom are strictly secondary. The Soviet Constitution reflects this materialistic philosophy by placing its emphasis on material security: housing, food, clothing, medical care. These are the same things that might be provided in a prison. The basic concept is that the government has full responsibility for the welfare of the people. But in order to discharge that responsibility, it must assume absolute control of all their activities. It is significant that in actuality, the Russian people have few of the rights supposedly guaranteed to them in their constitution, while the American people have them in abundance, even though they are not guaranteed by our government. The reason is obvious. Unless the people bake one loaf of bread for each citizen, there will not be a loaf of bread for each citizen to eat. Constitutions can be written, laws can be passed, and imperial decrees can be issued. But unless the bread is produced, it can never be distributed. The American philosophy of limited government and individual responsibility has enabled us to achieve an abundance undreamed of in ancient times, and the principle behind it can be reduced to a rather simple formula. Widespread abundance must be achieved before economic security for all is even possible. Industrious and efficient production are necessary to create this abundance. Labor that is energetic, willing, and eager makes such production possible. Such labor can be obtained only with incentive. Of all forms of incentive, the freedom to attain a reward for one's labors is the most sustaining for most people. Sometimes called the profit motive, it is simply the right to plan and to earn and to enjoy the fruits of your labor. This profit motive diminishes as government controls, regulations, and taxes increase to deny the fruits of success to those who produce. Therefore, government intervention to redistribute the material rewards of labor results in the eventual destruction of the productive base of society. When this base is destroyed, real abundance and security for more than the ruling elite is quite impossible.
America, the land of the free and the home of the brave. This great land was founded on individualism. We as citizens have God-given rights. We even passed the Bill of Rights to protect them. Since the beginning, our forefathers understood that people were endowed with the right to property. They state, "Private property and freedom are inseparable. Property must be secure or liberty cannot exist." Our forefathers knew the dangers of big government and how it can threaten the rights of the people. They overthrew a government that told people what to do in critical aspects of their lives. For the first time in history, a document was created that protected the rights of citizens through limited government. We as Americans have the God-given rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. For generations, Americans have fought to protect our great land and freedom. Today, the fight not only continues, but expands to many areas, including our environment. As good stewards of Earth, Americans are traveling on the road to environmentalism. Recycling has been a common practice for most of human history. One of the first big pushes occurred in the 1970s through government mandates. As time passed, environmental protection went from a local phenomenon to a worldwide movement. Saving planet Earth became a common goal. This goal took shape through the United Nations. Beginning in 1983, the United Nations asked the World Commission on Environment and Development, also called the Brundtland Commission, to propose long-term strategies for achieving sustainable development by the year 2000 and beyond. By 1987, in the name of preserving the food supply and clean water, sustainable development was introduced. Director General of the World Health Organization and Vice President of Socialist Internationale, Gro Harlem Brundtland, led a commission that released a report called Our Common Future. In it, they defined sustainable development as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. It sounds like something we can all support. After all, who doesn't want to preserve the land for future generations so they can have clean water and plant and reap their harvests? As sustainable development took shape, other issues within the UN progressed. In 1992, an Earth Summit was convened under the auspices of the UN to formulate policy for the world environmental movement. At the summit, they issued a report entitled Agenda 21. The number 21 stands for the 21st century. In his opening speech, the General Secretary of the summit, Maurice Strong, who is also a member of the Brundtland Commission, said, "Current lifestyles and consumption patterns of the affluent middle class, involving high meat intake, use of fossil fuels, appliances, home and work air conditioning, and suburban housing, are not sustainable." It sounds as if sustainable development is taking on an agenda that can possibly curtail one's eating habits, the ability to drive using any type of vehicle, and even limiting one's ability to own a home in the suburbs. What are their true intentions? At the conclusion of the Earth Summit, in the euphoria of the moment, Agenda 21 was signed by 178 world leaders, including President George H.W. Bush. Since then, subsequent events have led American leaders, including Presidents Clinton and Obama, to sign further agreements and executive orders implementing Agenda 21. Environmental activist and attorney Daniel Sitars states, Agenda 21 proposes an array of actions which are intended to be implemented by every person on Earth. Effective execution of Agenda 21 will require a profound reorientation of all human society, unlike anything the world has ever experienced. A major shift in the priorities of both governments and individuals, and an unprecedented redeployment of human and financial resources. This kind of government control may sound inconceivable for a country like America, but in June of 1993, President Clinton issued Executive Order 12852 to create the President's Council on Sustainable Development. The purpose of the PCSD was to translate the recommendations set forth in Agenda 21 into public policy administered by the federal government. Now, this begs the question, what UN mandates are being funneled through the federal government to our local communities? So now, let's see how Agenda 21 is affecting the United States Bill of Rights and Constitution. In the UN's 1996 publication, Global Biodiversity Assessment, it states, property rights are not absolute and unchanging, but rather a complex, dynamic, and shifting relationship between two or more parties over space and time. Agenda 21's view toward private property can be traced back to the 1976 UN Conference on Human Settlement. In their Report of Habitat, the private ownership of land section reads, land, because of its unique nature and the crucial role it plays in human settlements, cannot be treated as an ordinary asset, controlled by individuals and subject to the pressures and inefficiencies of the market. Private ownership is also a principal instrument of the accumulation and concentration of wealth, and therefore contributes to social injustice. If unchecked, it may become a major obstacle in the planning and implementation of development schemes. This is contrary to the views of George Washington, John Adams, and the other founders of the United States. Agenda 21's view on private property is comparable to that of the Soviet Union, where private ownership was replaced with collective ownership. To explain, let's look at the first actions taken by Vladimir Lenin and his Bolshevik government. Following the October Revolution of 1917, agrarian land reforms did away with the people's private ownership of farms. The farms were seized and converted into government-mandated collective farms. On these collective farms, the ruling Soviet government determined production quotas, which are similar to what is being recommended by the PCSD to bring the rates of harvest into line. With the guidance of UN affiliates, sustainable development programs have found their way into local communities. A good example took place in Contra Costa County, California in 2011. At a meeting to explain sustainable development, the following took place between the organizers and the citizens. An attendee did not understand what was meant by preserving open space.
So open space is sort of defined as anything that does not currently have development on it. So it would be defined as agricultural areas or natural areas that don't have urban development on them, either industrial, commercial, or housing.
Are you talking about government open space, or are you talking about private open space? People's private property, like eminent domain?
It's both.
Both? After much confusion from the citizens, a woman stated,
Private property is part of that's part of our constitutional values for people to have and be able to do whatever they want with their own private property. And for us to sit here and say they can't use their own property and you're calling it open space is somebody's private property.
these types of meetings lead to more questions than answers. What are the true intentions of sustainable development? Private property rights are only one aspect of sustainable development. It affects an even more fundamental aspect of life, life itself. Let's look at the Chinese Communist government and its one-child policy. Just like marriage in China, there are numerous hurdles to overcome before permission is granted. For a Chinese couple to have a child, they have to get a birth license. In order for the couple to get a license, they have to go through a procedure that runs through local Communist Party functionaries. Without a birth license, no hospital or doctor can treat the mother or the child before, during, or after the birth. The Chinese are required to inform the authorities of any illegal birth. In short, the Chinese government is in complete control. Since China is one of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, it has a great deal of influence on UN policy and how they view population control. China's one-child policy is now being considered as a viable solution towards sustainable development. The PCSD shows their support of this very idea in their 1998 publication, Sustainable America. We must move towards stabilization of the U.S. population and a reduced rate of population growth in the United States and the world. Sustainable America also promotes Agenda 21's view on education for sustainable development. We must expand the number of curricula, materials, and training opportunities that teach the principles of sustainable development. Generally speaking, it sounds as if the UN is altering children's school or college curriculum to improve the quality of education. On the surface, this sounds very positive. But is something missing here? What exactly are they changing, and how is this going to be implemented? Looking at the big picture, how is this directly affecting us and our individual freedom? It extends into many areas at state levels. One in particular is recommending large-scale training of new government workers to enforce sustainable development. A good example is taking place in Madison, Wisconsin. In the publication, Building a More Sustainable Future in Wisconsin, it emphasizes the importance of state and federal training and education programs to generate educators, facilitators, and motivators who would be capable of going into individual homes and helping people develop their own personalized sustainability action plans. This sounds as if, for the good of our communities, we can look forward to trained government employees entering our homes. How will this directly violate your freedom? Agenda 21 is much more than private property, population control, and education. It affects nearly every aspect of your life. The following is a partial list of what Agenda 21 also promotes. Relocating people from rural areas to cities, higher gas prices, manipulating transportation patterns, forbidding human access to land, seizure of private property, restricting the amount of water use, additional taxing, restricting the amount of waste, forced community involvement, and the list goes on. In support of saving the Earth, affiliates of the UN have continued to expand into local communities through programs known as Local Agenda 21. The main organization that local governments joined to be part of Local Agenda 21 is ICLEI. ICLEI stands for the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives. Founded in 1990, it was established when more than 200 local governments from 43 countries convened at its inaugural conference at the UN. ICLEI states that it provides technical consulting, training, and information services to build capacity, share knowledge, and support local government in the implementation of sustainable development at the local level. ICLEI has begun to entrench itself within the United States. As of today, the U.S. has by far the most local governments involved in ICLEI, exceeding 500. In 3 clicks, you can find out if your community is a member of ICLEI, the UN affiliate. Go to ICLEI.org. On the top menu bar of the website, click on Members. On the left side of the column, click on Global Members. Here, you will see countries listed alphabetically. Scroll down to the United States of America to find your city or town. If you don't find yours, look for others in your surrounding areas. Now, to verify that ICLEI is part of the United Nations, do the same as before. Go to ICLEI.org. On the top menu bar of the website, click on Program. Scroll down and click Agenda 21. Upon clicking on Agenda 21, you'll be redirected to the official UN webpage for the United Nations local Agenda 21. Citizens all over the country are beginning to wake up to the problems with Agenda 21 and its sustainable development. Americans are taking back their communities one at a time by dropping ICLEI membership. For example, in Edmond, Oklahoma, a small group of concerned Americans took action. They created a plan that would inform key business leaders and influential citizens about the dangers of ICLEI. Within time, the mayor and city council were persuaded to vote to drop ICLEI. So as you can see, it not only can be done, it is being done. To discover how you can get ICLEI out of your community, visit the Stop Agenda 21 page at jbs.org. This will give you the materials you need to learn more. Once informed, you can learn ways to tell others about the dangers of sustainable development. And finally, we encourage concerned Americans to get involved and take action. Samuel Adams once said, "The liberties of our country, the freedom of our civil constitution are worth defending against all hazards, and it is our duty to defend them against all attacks." Regardless of your political affiliation, we are all individuals with freedoms and unalienable rights. We are all Americans.